Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for coming, and thanks to Katie and everyone else at the Peninsula School and Stanford for making this possible. And most of all, again, to you for making it possible so that I don't have to talk to myself. I travel a lot, too much perhaps. One day when I was on an airplane that had landed and was making its way to the gate, the little ding signaled that we could now retrieve our chickens or pianos or whatever from the overhead compartments. And as people were gathering their stuff, right ahead of me there was a man who leaned over to a man with a child and said, "Your boy was so good during this flight." And a little ding went off in my head when I heard that, because the word good theoretically can mean honorable or ethical or compassionate, but I was reminded that where children are concerned, it's more likely to mean not a pain in the butt to me. Good means well-behaved. Good means quiet where children are concerned. And that may help to explain how it is that so many books and articles written for parents are really focused not on helping kids to become good people, but merely on focusing on getting kids to do whatever it is we demand, which often has to do with their simply being compliant. The means we use toward that end may have changed a bit over the last generation or two. In the old generation, and still in some places now, there are places where in some families the means are like, your butt's going to be sore when your father gets home. Whereas now the means in some places are more likely to be, there's a shiny dinosaur sticker for you if you don't make a fuss in the restaurant tonight. The means have changed, but the goal is still control. The goal is still compliance, which leads me to think about whether there are other goals we have that may be of greater consequence to us. So let me ask you to think about that right now. If you are a parent, what are your long-term goals for your child or children? How would you like them to turn out long after they've left you? Take just a moment to think about that. See if there is a word or a phrase, perhaps, that springs to mind that captures for you your long-term objective for your child. Okay, who's got a word, a goal? What would you like?
Love learning.
To love learning. Okay, thank you. Yes?
To have a purpose.
To have a purpose.
Independent.
You would like your child to be independent. Happy. Thank you. Yes?
Resilient.
Resilient. Thank you. Yes? Sorry? Healthy? Confident. Sorry. Competent? Confident. Thank you.
Engaged.
Engaged, not necessarily to be married. Yes. Fulfilled. Thank you. Anything else not said?
A good human being.
A good human being. Yes? Passionate. And? Self-actualizing. Let's make that our list. So we, in this group, would like kids to love learning and have a purpose in life about which they are passionate. We want them to be independent and resilient, confident, engaged, happy, and fulfilled, to be good human beings who are self-actualizing. Any generalizations about this list? It's a tall order. It's interesting to think about this because I get the same kinds of adjectives wherever I go. Different kinds of communities, parents, and teachers, incidentally. And now the hard part comes. That was the easy part. The hard part is to weigh what we do with our kids against our own long-term goals. Whether what we say to them when they make a fuss in the supermarket, what we do with them when it's trouble getting them out the door in the morning, is consistent with helping them to become all of that? That's the key question. And you don't even have to think about long-term goals. You try another experiment. Pretend that you are at a birthday party or a school, and you overhear two parents, other parents around the corner, talking about your child. What would you most like to hear them say? My guess is, my hope is, that it's not, boy, that kid, you never hear a peep out of him, does everything she's told. And yet, sometimes we act as though that was the long-term goal that we had. That consistency is what I want to talk about tonight. Because in fact, I would argue that we respond overwhelmingly in this country with too much control over kids. The idea that the number one problem in our society with parenting is that we're too permissive and spoiled brats are running wild is essentially a fiction, a huge exaggeration of reality in order to rationalize still more of the controlling methods that are already in abundance. Yes, there are some kids, in some places more than others, who do run wild and make noise in public places, and that's annoying. But for every child like that, there are hundreds of children who are restricted unnecessarily, yelled at, threatened by their parents, essentially bullied, who hear an automatic no in response to their questions. And a because I said so if they ask for a reason, their own questions dismissed out of hand and their protests routinely ignored. That is the overwhelming reality of American parenting. But don't take my word for it. Go to a shopping mall this Saturday and simply look through the eyes of an anthropologist to what it is you see. And you will realize that this tendency to treat kids fundamentally disrespectfully in order to get them to do whatever we demand, regardless of whether there's a good reason, is part of the problem. Now, here's the interesting thing. Not only does that style of do it because I said so fail to help kids become happy and fulfilled and self-actualized and all the rest of it, the research surprised even me to the extent it showed research with very young kids demonstrating that the kids most likely just to do what their parents asked were the kids whose parents didn't tend to overemphasize compliance and control. The number one predictor to getting kids to pretty much do what we've requested them were parents who tended not to be heavy-handed, not to rely on power, but instead warmth and empathy and understanding to offer reasons for what they've asked and so on. It's important, of course, that in thinking about this, we don't fall into the common trap of a false dichotomy. Either you're punitive or you're permissive. False dichotomies are popular because they make choosing easy. If there's only two choices and one of them is obviously not okay. So there are some parents who say, ooh, I hate those parents who are just dictators with their kids, so I'm going to let my child do whatever he wants all the time. And conversely, other parents saying, I hate those parents who just never put their foot down and never interfere or provide any guidance, so therefore I'm going to read them the riot act, my house, my rules. In fact, those are not the only two options. I'm not a fan of permissiveness any more than I am of punitiveness. And as the evening continues, I'll say more about what I think the alternatives to that are. And I should add here that not only are those not the only two alternatives, but it's also the case that we don't necessarily have a well-functioning household if one parent plays one role and the other parent plays the other. The idea that two dysfunctional patterns would cancel each other out and produce health, not necessarily logical. It's like the old statistician's joke. You put your head in the freezer and your feet in the oven, and the average temperature is very comfortable. It doesn't work like that. In fact, there are some individual parents who swing between the two opposites themselves. One mother said, I'm so permissive, I'm permissive until I can't stand my child, at which point I become so punitive that I can't stand myself. So these are not the only possibilities, which is good news for an individual, for a pair of parents, or, for that matter, for an entire society. But we love these dichotomies. Teachers sometimes fall into this too. Either I'm in control of the classroom, or there's chaos. That's it, control or chaos. This reminds me of Get Smart, but it does not remind me of healthy teaching, because there are alternatives. It's important to realize, though, that when I'm talking about control, I'm not just talking about authoritarian stuff. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute. There are many parents, perhaps some in this audience, who would never dream of taking a hand to a child, but still emphasize control, and they might say, "Good job," when the child does exactly what has been ordered. The goal is still mindless obedience, but because it has this candy coating on it, it is merely, you might say, sugar-coated control. And that's not any closer to what I'm arguing, because control is the problem, irrespective of the methods used to secure that control. Now, when we control kids through whatever methods, it often tends to lead to one or another possible reaction. It's kind of interesting. Some of you may already be familiar with the idea that two very different personality patterns can come from the same underlying dynamic. You don't have to be a strict Freudian to acknowledge that that's true. For example, some people are constantly insecure, constantly doubting themselves, constantly feeling guilty and trying not to attract attention because they think they're worthless. That describes a kind of low self-esteem pattern. But there are other people who are out there all the time needing to be the center of attention, constantly bragging about themselves. If they have enough money, putting their name on buildings. And the paradoxical reality is, many psychologically attuned people would say, those people too are suffering from fundamental doubts about their own value and worth and are trying to overcompensate. So here we have two opposite patterns coming from the same underlying personality issues. That's just an analogy. Here's the version of that I want to emphasize now. Some kids react to controlling parents by being excessively compliant, and some react to the same parental pattern by being excessively defiant. And neither is particularly healthy. There are some parents who don't even understand the idea of excessive compliance. How could you have too much of kids doing what you tell them? There are times, as the parent of two children myself, where I have that temptation to think that way, but I know better. Because kids who cannot, rather than choose not to, but cannot say no, take a stand, resist, at least on occasion, have sometimes sacrificed their selves so that they don't even know who they are in a desperate effort to try to win their parents' love. We used to turn up our nose at what were called somewhat old-fashioned and sexist phrase, yes men in the corporations who just basically never challenged the boss. And yet some of us act as if we wanted yes children, though it doesn't really prove to be any healthier. But then there are other kids who, because of the same control, react by fighting all the time, picking battles, or so it seems to us that they're the ones picking them. And they react with this excessive defiance because they need to recapture some of their sense of autonomy that has been denied. They provoke a confrontation in order to prove that they still have some power. And where do they learn to use that power? From us, because authoritarian parenting doesn't just make them mad, It teaches them how to direct their anger against other people. Traditional controlling parenting models bullying, and kids learn the lesson all too well. Some of them thumb their nose at all authority figures, not just us. In fact, if they're afraid to thumb their nose at us, it may go underground. In effect, they go behind your back. So that lay down the law type parenting, you do what I say, I don't want to hear any back talk, leads kids sometimes to create a whole separate identity where they appear to be so well behaved that they are the envy of the neighbors. Meanwhile, behind our backs are doing hair-raising things, precisely because of what seemed to us on the surface to be effective. They lead a double life, and they are often at risk of psychological problems down the line, to say nothing of perpetual resentment of and alienation from the people who were controlling them. I got an email from a woman who spent Christmas with her husband's relatives who were raised and are now raising their own kids with firm discipline. And these people told stories of their youthful escapades. She writes, "Those well-behaved, regularly disciplined, polite children were impetuous hooligans every time their parents' backs were turned. They did stuff I never could have invented." She adds that on her side of the family, by contrast, there has never been a behavior chart, an incentive, a schedule of punishments, a grounding, a spanking, or a removal of privileges, nor, she swears, has there ever been any serious misbehavior. It's interesting to look beneath the surface, beyond what appears to work in a superficial sense. Now, when you over-control, what tends to happen is kids lose their ability also to control themselves when it's appropriate to do so. Kids are born with what one researcher called a gyroscope of natural self-regulation. Not with everything. They need us for guidance and help a lot. But with some things it's true. Take food, for example. Kids can't be trusted to eat the healthiest foods when left to their own devices. But young children have a sense of how much food they need. They will regulate their own caloric intake. Some days, my kids would eat so little that I really began to worry, but then a day or two later would put away enough for 3 kids. Because they know, their body knows they're sensitive to their cues, or at least they're sensitive to their body's cues until we try to take over for them and run their bodies for them. So a really interesting experiment looked at 2 to 4-year-old kids and watched for the little kids whose parents tended to over-control their eating. Parents who would insist that the kids eat at this time, mealtime, as opposed to when they were hungry, or who insisted they clean their plates and eat stuff even when they obviously were no longer hungry, or who used dessert as a reward to get them to eat other foods, and found that these kids had lost the ability to be sensitive to their own body's cues because they were now being controlled from outside, and many of these kids were already growing fat before they were even out of diapers. The parents were in the process of passing on their own eating issues to their kids. Food is just an example. It's a powerful and universal example of, and again, you don't have to have crude authoritarian kind of control. If you say, if you eat this, then you get to eat that, and the kind of parents who are always hectoring, and why don't you eat a little more, and let's take another bite of this, and you have to eat some of that. Pretty soon, kids feel, I don't have any control over this, and they don't even know when they're hungry. Here's another surprisingly parallel example. Ethics. External regulation, again, can interfere with the development of internal regulation and thinking about right and wrong. Kids who are pressured to do what they're told, this is right and this is wrong because I, your parents, say so, are unlikely to think through ethical dilemmas for themselves even when they're old enough to do so. And it creates a vicious circle because the less chance they have to make ethical decisions on their own, the more likely they are to act in ways where the parents then point to their behavior as a reason for continuing to tell them what to do, because they're obviously not mature enough to make those decisions on their own. And thus, it's a vicious circle. Here's another example. When we control kids to excess, when they're forced to do things, or they're too tightly regulated in the way they do things, their interest in whatever they're doing begins to decline. So, for example, one researcher did a study with very little kids, like I think about a year or so old, and put parents in the room with them and some toys. And some parents were content to watch the kids and smile and offer encouragement or help when it seemed needed, and otherwise let the child explore the toy on his or her own. And there were other parents who were much more concerned about making sure the thing was done correctly, taking over for the child. No, put that thing in over there, honey. Not there, there, and so on. And then the parents were ushered out and the kids were watched with new toys. Those who had controlling parents were less interested in the new toy, less likely to play with it on their own. A later study with school-age kids found that when they had tasks involving maps and poetry, when parents tended to be over-controlling, taking over and doing a lot of this for the kid to make sure it was done right, because I know better, those children were not only less interested in the learning activities, but less proficient at them when new tasks were presented. By the way, there's an interesting analogy here with teachers. When teachers feel pressured to pressure kids because of demands for accountability and higher standards, they feel controlled and often respond by becoming controlling. The result being that they remove almost any opportunity for the kids to play an active role in their own learning, which a raft of research demonstrates is one of the best predictors to effective learning. That's why a study in Colorado found that when teachers were told to raise standards and hold students accountable because they themselves were going to be held accountable, their students actually didn't do as well, even on a conventional test, as students whose teachers were simply told, see if you can facilitate your child's understanding, your children's understanding of this material. So control tends to be counterproductive on so many levels. Some kids become unable to resist even when resistance makes sense, because they become wholly owned subsidiaries of their parents. Other kids fight back inappropriately, sometimes picking fights with their peers. You can actually watch the result of traditional controlling parenting with children who then begin to act out in this desperate desire to reclaim their sense of power and control in the world with their peers, with disastrous results. And then we have kids who lose their ability to be interested in stuff, to know their own body's cues, or to think about right and wrong.